I remember the first time I saw something move outside the submersible that wasn't supposed to exist. A shadow sliding across the Mariana Trench's black depths, like it was alive and studying me. They told me there are 11 rules I have to follow if I want to survive here, but no one explained what would happen if I slipped even once. Each rule feels like a lifeline in water that wants to swallow me whole, a boundary between sanity and whatever hunts us beneath the pressure. I still don't know if following them is enough, or if I was already too late. Even before the sub's lights flickered for the first time, I felt a weight pressing through the water, something that seemed to watch without eyes. I remember my mentor leaning over the console, his voice low and strained as he said, "Don't do it, whatever you see. Just keep looking straight ahead." That was the first time I fully understood what Rule 1, never look directly into the shadows outside the submersible, meant, though I didn't want to admit how terrified I was. The Mariana Trench stretched beneath us like a pit of black oil, and every movement of the water seemed deliberate, almost knowing. I tried to focus on the instrumentation, the blinking panels and gauges, but the shadows lurking just beyond the windows kept tugging at my mind. I could feel my pulse in the confined metal cabin, a drumbeat that seemed too loud against the hollow silence surrounding the vessel. The engineer, Luis, smirked nervously, trying to mask his unease. "It's just the pressure playing tricks," he muttered, leaning against the console. I wanted to believe him, but every instinct screamed that the darkness outside was alive, sliding along the ridges and crevices of the trench, with a patience that was impossible to ignore. The sub's small lights barely penetrated the void, and whenever the beam caught movement, I felt a twitch of dread ripple across my spine. Hours passed, though it felt like days, and I found myself peering again against my better judgment. A faint shimmer moved along the trench wall, a shape I couldn't identify, and I recoiled immediately, reminding myself why Rule 1 existed. The shadows didn't obey the laws of physics. They slipped in angles that should have been impossible, disappearing when I tried to track them. "I told you not to stare," Luis whispered from the corner, voice taut with something I couldn't name. His words made my stomach churn, but I knew he was only reinforcing what we both feared, that even the tiniest glance could summon consequences we weren't ready for. Time became meaningless as we drifted deeper, every meter stretching the metal hull's limits. The instruments began to twitch in ways that were hard to explain. Lights flickered, gauges quivered, and sometimes for a fraction of a second, the shadows seemed closer than the glass barrier should allow. I tried to focus on breathing steadily, counting in my head to maintain a semblance of control, but the trench had its own rhythm, and I felt like a guest intruding on something primordial. "It's only shadows," I told myself, though my voice betrayed panic, bouncing back from the walls in hollow echoes. Each moment outside the sub's lights was a test, and I realized how easily humans could convince themselves that danger wasn't real until it's too late. Luis grew restless, pacing in the cramped space, his boots clanging lightly against the floor. "I swear I just saw it move closer," he said, but his eyes darted nervously away from the windows. "Move what?" I asked, trying to steady my voice, but even I didn't want the answer. There was a tension in the air, unspoken but tangible, a pressing presence that made the sub feel both fragile and claustrophobic. Every shadow seemed to stretch and bend toward us, and my fingers unconsciously clutched the console, nails digging into metal, as if the tactile sensation could ground me in reality. I realized then that Rule 1 was not about safety from the physical, but a measure against losing the mind in the trench's infinite darkness. The sub's cameras occasionally picked up anomalies, shapes that didn't belong, a fleeting outline, a ripple that shouldn't exist in still water, and sometimes a glimmer of reflective eyes that disappeared as soon as I blinked. "We're not alone," Luis murmured, and for once I didn't scoff. That statement wasn't a joke, it was an observation weighed down with fear. I tried to communicate with the surface, but every transmission seemed delayed or distorted. Voices stretched thin as if the trench itself was filtering reality. I felt utterly isolated, and the weight of Rule 1 pressed harder on my consciousness. reminding me that sometimes survival depended more on restraint than action. Night came without warning. The sub's internal lights dimmed to conserve power, leaving only the pale glow of instrumentation. I remember clutching the armrests of my chair, glancing out the window for what I promised myself would be the last time. A figure, or something shaped like a figure, slid across the abyss, moving with an intelligence that unsettled me beyond words. "Did you see that?" I whispered, though I feared admitting it might draw attention from whatever lurked outside. Luis shook his head, pretending to focus on readings, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. Rule 1 became a mantra in my head. Don't look, don't engage, just survive. The pressure increased, the sub creaking under forces that were almost palpable, and I realized that staying alert was both a necessity and a punishment. Shadows moved in ways that no light could penetrate fully. They were suggestions rather than forms, insinuating themselves into perception. I tried to maintain a scientific mindset, documenting anomalies in the logs, but each entry felt like a confession, a record of terror I could not escape. Luis finally broke the silence, muttering, "It's getting closer," and I realized that even acknowledging their presence made the darkness more insistent, like a predator aware of our fear. I tightened my grip and reminded myself once again why Rule 1 existed, though the thought offered no comfort. By the time we reached the trench's deepest mapped section, the weight of isolation was almost unbearable. The shadows now seemed to have purpose, almost studying us as we floated helplessly in their domain. The sub's lights cast meager beams into blackness that was so dense it felt tangible, and every movement outside created ripples that unsettled my equilibrium. Luis tried to crack a joke, his voice shaking. Maybe it just wants to say hello, but the humor fell flat against the oppressive dark. I understood then that the rule was not merely caution. It was a barrier between curiosity and death, between observing and being observed. And then something shifted. A shadow slid along the hull's exterior, slower this time, deliberate, as if measuring our reactions. I felt the metal tremor under my fingertips, though the instruments showed nothing abnormal. I think it knows we're here," Luis stammered, voice barely audible. My chest tightened, breath caught in my throat, and for a terrifying moment, I considered breaking Rule 1 entirely, just to see what it was. But instinct screamed no, and I forced myself to look only at the console, counting every second until the beam of light passed harmlessly across empty water. Even so, a chill settled deep in my bones, and I realized that the submersible was no longer just a vessel. It had become a fragile island of sanity in a sea of something unknowable, something that would not forgive mistakes. The weight of silence pressed down on the cabin after the shadows passed, but curiosity gnawed at me relentlessly. I tried to steady my breathing, to focus on the instruments, yet a part of me wanted to reach beyond the glass, to know what watched us. That was when I remembered Rule 2. Never attempt to communicate with anything outside the submersible, though the words felt hollow, almost meaningless against the oppressive dark. Luis leaned close, whispering. I keep thinking I hear whispers, like someone's trying to speak through the water. I told him to hush, but a shiver ran down my spine, as if the trench itself was listening to us. The sub creaked under the pressure of the abyss, and I felt a strange pull toward the windows, despite knowing the consequences. Shadows swirled just beyond the light, their edges fluid and teasing, as if inviting a response. I focused on the consoles, documenting every anomaly, but every beep and flicker seemed to carry meaning, a language I wasn't meant to understand. Maybe it's testing us, Luis muttered, rubbing his hands over his eyes. I shook my head, trying to suppress a rising panic. Communication could be deadly, that much I understood. Hours stretched on, each tick of the clock magnified in the cramped cabin. I found myself imagining the things outside responding to thought, to intention, and the compulsion to speak, even mentally, was terrifying. The water outside the sub was a living mirror of our fears, reflecting movement that didn't exist in reality. Do you ever feel like it's watching what we do in real time? I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Luis nodded slowly, tension etched into every line of his face. He understood, but understanding didn't make the urge to reach out any less dangerous. I kept reminding myself why Rule 2 existed, yet the trench had a way of warping thought, of making restraint feel impossible. Every instrument flicker, and every shadow seemed to answer questions I hadn't asked. I tried to distract myself, tracing charts, adjusting controls, but the pressure of curiosity pressed harder than the ocean above. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears, and for a moment I felt as if the walls themselves might dissolve into water. Luis tried to joke about it, but his laughter faltered mid-sentence, swallowed by the tension that hung thick and suffocating. By mid-mission, fatigue was setting in, and even the sub's limited lighting felt insufficient. Shadows moved differently now, more purposeful, and the whispers, or what I thought were whispers, seemed to grow louder, pressing against my skull. I caught myself almost reaching for the microphone, imagining sending a signal or even murmuring into the void. The moment my hand twitched, a chill shot through me, and I immediately remembered Rule 2, shoving the impulse back down. Luis noticed my sudden rigidity, whispering, Don't even think about it." I nodded, forcing my attention back to the readings, but I knew the water outside was aware of every lapse in focus. The instruments began acting strangely, recording signals we couldn't explain. Shapes appeared and disappeared outside the windows, some stretching impossibly, bending angles that should have been physically impossible. I considered reaching for the comms, just to ask a question, just to see if the water would answer, but a sense of dread rooted me in place. Luis murmured about patterns in the signals, how they seemed almost conversational, and I shivered at the implication. Even the smallest attempt at engagement could trigger a reaction we weren't prepared for, a lesson Rule 2 seemed designed to enforce. As we descended further, the sub's metal groaned, and every shift in the abyssal currents felt deliberate. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was circling the vessel, testing us, mapping our reactions. The lights caught glimmers that could have been reflections, or eyes, or intelligence, and I refused to confirm anything by looking directly. "It's waiting for us to make a sound," Luis whispered, voice tight. I pressed a hand over my mouth, choking back the words I wanted to say. The idea of communicating with whatever lurked beyond the hull was a temptation so strong it felt like it could drive a person mad. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the trench pressing closer, shadows coiling toward us, waiting for any signal of acknowledgement. The hum of the engines and the gentle vibration of the sub were the only anchors keeping my mind from unraveling. I tried to write in the log, describing the shapes, the movements, the whispers, but every stroke of the pen seemed insufficient, as if the abyss itself might consume it. Luis kept glancing toward the windows, eyes wide, silently reminding me that a single word could be catastrophic. By the time the sub reached a mapped cavern deeper than any we had previously explored, something shifted outside the light's reach. Shadows condensed, then split, sliding with precision along the rock face. I felt a compulsion to reach out, to send some kind of signal, but the warning in my mind rang clear. Rule 2 exists for a reason. The moment I considered it, a ripple passed through the water, almost like a pulse in response to my thought. My chest tightened, and I realized that the silence we maintained was as fragile as the hull surrounding us. Luis finally admitted he thought he saw a form watching from the dark, its edges indistinct but undeniably deliberate. "I feel like it's learning," he whispered. I swallowed hard, nodding, refusing to meet the blackness outside. The urge to communicate gnawed at my resolve, but we stayed silent, recording, observing, counting every pulse, every flicker in the water. The tension became unbearable. The sub felt like a thin barrier between life and whatever lurked beneath. I understood, in a visceral way, why Rule 2 was the second of 11, because one misstep could mean losing everything. Then, without warning, a sudden movement streaked past the window, faster than anything natural, and the sub rocked ever so slightly. I heard Luis breathe sharply, and I realized that for the first time, the shadows seemed aware of our awareness. They weren't just passive observers, they were participants in a dangerous game, and any attempt to reach out could provoke them. I clenched my hands, staring at the controls, feeling the enormity of what Rule 2 demanded: total restraint, even in the face of the impossible and the unknown. By the end of our descent that day, the tension had hollowed us out. Shadows lingered at the edge of light, movement, and intent so alien that even rational explanation failed. I forced myself to record everything methodically, making notes, diagrams, and observations, all while resisting the urge to interact. Luis finally muttered, "If we break the rules," and trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. The sub rocked slightly again, and I realized that obeying Rule 2 was no guarantee of safety. It was simply buying time, and the time itself felt terrifyingly finite. The first time I felt the sub lose power for even a moment, a chill swept through me that had nothing to do with the cold metal beneath my fingers. I remembered Rule 3, never let the lights outside the submersible go out completely, though it seemed almost impossible to follow in these depths. The Mariana Trench was a place where darkness swallowed everything, and even the faintest shadow could conceal horrors we weren't meant to see. Luis tapped the controls nervously, murmuring, "If we lose the lights, it's done," and I nodded, gripping the edge of the console. I could feel the pressure of isolation intensify, the abyss pressing closer with every flicker of the failing lights. The sub's external lamps flickered intermittently, forcing me to lean forward, squinting through the glass at shapes that moved just beyond the beam. A long ridge of rock loomed black and unyielding, and I swore I saw something glide across it too fast to be natural. Luis muttered, "It's just your eyes. The trench plays tricks," but I knew better. Each time the lights dimmed, the shadows seemed to stretch further, as though tasting our fear. I felt the sub shudder under unseen currents, and my chest tightened with a terror I couldn't name, aware that failing Rule 3 could mean far more than just darkness. Hours passed in a tense rhythm of flickering lights and fleeting shadows. I tried to document the anomalies, recording shapes and movements, but each entry felt inadequate. The water outside seemed alive, rippling with subtle motions that our lights only partially revealed. I noticed the smallest details: a thin line that shouldn't move, a reflection that wasn't ours, a distortion that bent the edges of the abyss unnaturally. Luis kept pacing, whispering calculations and hypotheses, but even he avoided looking at the windows too long. The lights were the thin barrier between our fragile vessel and whatever watched from the trench. Then, without warning, a faint hum began reverberating through the sub's metal frame, synchronized with the flicker of the lamps. I realized that the shadows outside weren't just passive observers. They were aware of the lights, waiting for them to fail. I tried to adjust the intensity, to stabilize the beam, but the subsystems were strained, reacting sluggishly under the extreme pressure. Luis's voice trembled when he said, "It's testing us, every flicker counts." I nodded grimly, tracing each wire and circuit with my fingers, but even technical measures felt inadequate against the abyss. The trench demanded constant vigilance, a refusal to let the lights fail even for a heartbeat. As we descended further, the shadows grew bolder, moving in shapes and angles that defied logic. I found myself gripping the window frame, focusing on the illuminated areas, terrified to look elsewhere. The lights provided a fragile sense of control, a barrier that Rule 3 demanded we maintain. Each beam seemed like a lifeline, but the deeper we went, the more the trench challenged that barrier. Luis muttered again, "If they notice even a flicker, they'll," and he left the sentence unfinished, the implication more terrifying than any explanation. Sleep was impossible in that confined cabin. Our brains refused rest while the abyss hummed around us. Shadows pressed against the edges of light, bending and coiling, sometimes lingering at the very edge of perception. I traced every cable, every switch, adjusting power levels to keep the external lamps stable, but the effort was exhausting. Luis occasionally glanced at me, silent but wide-eyed, reminding me of our precarious situation. Rule 3 wasn't merely about illumination, it was about survival, the faintest lapse enough to invite attention from entities beyond comprehension. At one point the lights dimmed dangerously, and my stomach dropped as I felt the pulse of the abyss through the hull. Shapes emerged, twisting impossibly, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of something watching from the corner of the beam. Luis whispered, "Hold it steady, don't blink," though we both knew that even blinking could allow shadows to creep closer. My hands shook on the controls, adjusting power, feeling the metal vibrate beneath me. The faint beam finally stabilized, but the pressure of knowing we were moments away from catastrophe left me drained and trembling. Time began to blur, minutes and hours losing meaning, as the sub creaked and groaned under the immense pressure. The trench felt alive, moving subtly, almost as if testing our reactions to every shadow and flicker. Each time the lights dimmed even slightly, I felt a presence brush against the hull, an awareness that it knew we were fragile, that it understood the rule we struggled to follow. Luis tried to talk, to distract himself, but his voice quavered with tension, a constant reminder that Rule 3 was not negotiable. The abyss showed no mercy for mistakes. By the time we reached a mapped fissure deeper than any we'd encountered, the shadows seemed to pulse in tandem with the flicker of our lights. I realized that the trench itself was a predator, and the lights were our only shield. Any lapse might be fatal, and yet exhaustion and fear gnawed at my resolve. I gritted my teeth, adjusting controls, counting every second, trying to maintain that fragile barrier of illumination. Luis muttered about patterns, about movements that seemed coordinated, and I felt my skin crawl. The lights were not merely functional, they were our line between reality and oblivion, and Rule 3 demanded absolute compliance. Suddenly, the sub's lamps flickered violently, nearly plunging us into darkness. Shadows twisted, reaching, probing the hull as if testing our defenses. Luis froze, eyes wide, and whispered, they know the lights are weak." I tightened my grip, desperately manipulating circuits, sweat stinging my eyes as the hull groaned under pressure. The beam stabilized again, but the memory of that near blackout remained, a stark warning that the trench's patience was infinite, and ours was not. The abyss watched, and we could not falter. By the end of the descent for that day, the trench seemed to pulse around us, alive in ways that defied explanation. Shadows lingered at the edge of illumination, teasing and testing, reminding us of our fragility. Luis muttered, almost to himself, "We can't afford another flicker," and I felt the weight of that statement settle like a stone in my stomach. Rule 3 wasn't just a guideline, it was a commandment for survival, and the slightest failure could invite horrors beyond imagining. I realized that the sub was our only fragile tether, and we had to maintain the light, no matter what it cost us. The first time I felt the urge to pry open a sealed panel, I froze, recalling Rule 4. Never open any compartment on the submersible without permission, and a shiver ran down my spine. Luis glanced at me, sensing my hesitation, and muttered, "You know what's inside could change everything." The Mariana Trench pressed against the hull, shadows outside twisting in ways that made my skin crawl, and I realized the weight of our confinement was not just physical but psychological. Every panel in the sub was more than a simple storage space. Each held systems, experiments, and supplies that could be deadly if mishandled. My hands itched to check the nearest compartment, curiosity clawing at my reason. Hours earlier, the sub had shuddered violently as we navigated a narrow canyon, and I noticed a panel slightly ajar, a rare flaw in a vessel where precision was everything. The idea of opening it was maddening, a temptation that seemed to pulse in time with the darkness outside. I gritted my teeth and reminded myself of Rule 4, though the voice inside my head was screaming to just peek, to see what might be hidden behind the metal. Luis's eyes followed mine, dark and worried, and he whispered, "Don't just leave it." but I could feel that even his restraint was fraying under the oppressive weight of curiosity and fear. The trench outside seemed to respond to our inner turmoil. Shadows shifted with intelligence, almost observing our hesitation as though gauging our resolve. Each time I considered opening the compartment, a cold pressure pressed on my chest, warning me of consequences that I couldn't yet comprehend. Luis fiddled nervously with the controls, muttering about equipment failures and the dangers of tampering with sensitive systems. I forced myself to focus on the instruments, counting beats in my head, trying to ignore the silent, mocking beckon of the partially open panel. Minutes turned into hours, and the shadows outside moved like living ink, coiling around the canyon walls with purpose. The sub's lights flickered slightly, and every flicker made the compartment seem more menacing, more alive, as if something inside was waiting for me to break Rule 4. I swallowed hard, pressing my back against the console and watching Luis's anxious movements. He avoided looking at the panel entirely, and yet the tension between us was palpable, unspoken but heavy. The thought of what might happen if we disobeyed lingered like a phantom hand on my shoulder. I tried to document anomalies to distract myself, but the shadows outside were relentless, moving with speed and intelligence that made my heart pound. One elongated shape slithered along the trench wall, and I realized my pulse was echoing in rhythm with the unseen predator beyond the glass. Luis whispered something under his breath, a name I didn't recognize, and I sensed that fear had made even rational minds speak in superstition. The temptation to open the compartment persisted, gnawing at my resolve, yet Rule 4 loomed in my mind like a warning etched into my consciousness. As we continued deeper, the sub's metal groaned under the immense pressure, and every panel seemed to taunt me, demanding attention. Shadows converged at angles that should have been impossible, highlighting corners and edges of the vessel in ways that suggested movement inside. I clenched my fists, trying to focus on the charts, the instruments, the lifelines we had left. Luis muttered about the importance of isolation, of not disturbing systems that could have consequences we couldn't predict. The compartment remained closed, yet the urge to open it was suffocating, pressing in like the darkness surrounding us. I remembered the warnings from the mission briefing. Every compartment had a purpose, a reason it was sealed, and violating it could trigger catastrophes beyond our comprehension. Yet the human mind, pressed under stress and isolation, craves answers, craves understanding, craves control. Shadows flickered along the hull, reflecting in the small window like ghostly fingers, and I shivered at the thought that the abyss outside could be aware of our every temptation. Luis's whispers became frantic. Don't even think about it. And I realized we were both teetering on the edge of disobedience, knowing the rules were the only thing keeping us alive. Hours blurred as fatigue set in, the sub's lights trembling slightly under the pressure, casting long, twisting shadows across the metal interior. Every creak, every shift, felt like a warning from the abyss itself. I traced my fingers along the edge of the compartment, imagining what might be inside. Experiments, equipment, maybe something entirely alien, but I forced myself to retreat, pressing my back against the console. Luis's eyes met mine, wide with fear and understanding, and I realized that Rule 4 wasn't just about the danger of the unknown, it was about discipline, about resisting instincts that could lead to death. Then, without warning, the sub jolted violently, and the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into near darkness for a split second. Shadows outside warped and stretched as if in reaction to our hesitation, testing the boundaries of our resolve. Luis's voice was a strained whisper. If we open it, we'll regret it. I nodded, gripping the console, aware that even considering disobedience had drawn attention. The compartment stayed closed, but the air in the cabin felt charged, heavy with anticipation and fear, as if the trench itself had exhaled in warning. By the time we reached a relatively stable depth, the shadows outside lingered near the edges of the sub's lights, coiling and twisting, observing every micro-movement. The sub's hull vibrated subtly, resonating with the unknown presence, and I realized that obedience to Rule 4 was more than a precaution. It was a lifeline in a world where the rules were the only thin barrier between survival and the abyss. Luis muttered again, almost to himself, "We can't let curiosity kill us," and I felt the truth of it settle into my bones. The tension in the cabin was unbearable, a constant reminder that one wrong move, one impulsive action, could bring everything crashing down. The rest of the descent that day was spent in near silence, each of us hyper-aware of the shadows, the creaking metal, the flickering lights. I documented everything meticulously, trying to maintain some sense of control in a place where the unknown ruled. The compartment remained sealed, a silent warning, and I realized that the trench itself demanded respect and obedience. The darkness outside pulsed with a quiet, intelligent patience, and I understood fully why Rule 4 existed, because breaking it would mean confronting forces we weren't meant to understand, and survival depended on restraint above all else. The first time the sub lurched unexpectedly, my heart slammed against my ribs, as though it wanted to escape my chest, and I had to remind myself, almost desperately, Rule 5, never touch the controls in a panic. Luis's face was pale, sweat clinging to his temples, and he muttered, "If you start pressing buttons without thinking, we're done." The Mariana Trench felt suffocating, the blackness outside pressing against the hull with intent, as though the shadows themselves could sense a lapse in concentration. I gripped the console tightly, forcing myself to breathe slowly, counting the seconds as the sub shuddered, resisting the urge to react impulsively. Even a fraction of hesitation felt dangerous, a precipice over which we could fall. The sub's instrumentation flickered as we navigated a jagged trench wall, currents tugging at us unpredictably, and I felt the panic bubbling beneath the surface. Shadows outside darted, elongating in impossible angles, almost teasing us with their intelligence. Luis whispered, voice trembling, "One wrong move, and we could lose everything," and I nodded, trying to anchor myself in rationality. My hands hovered over the controls, itching to correct minor shifts, but I forced them to stay still, realizing the depth of what Rule 5 demanded: patience, precision, and restraint. The sub's metal groaned with every twist and turn, amplifying the tension until it felt like the abyss itself was pressing in on us. Hours crawled by, the sub's lights trembling with occasional flickers, shadows coiling along canyon walls like liquid predators. I tried to focus on the charts and readings, but every sudden movement, every unexpected creak, made my pulse spike. Luis's voice broke the silence intermittently, muttering observations about pressure, current, and the unpredictability of the abyss. The sub's cabin felt unbearably small, each panel and control a potential hazard if touched in a moment of fear. I kept reminding myself of Rule 5, though it was increasingly difficult to maintain calm when the trench seemed alive and aware of our every twitch. At one point, a rapid vibration coursed through the sub, setting off alarms and causing my fingers to twitch involuntarily. Shadows outside blurred with speed, appearing in forms that defied logic, testing our composure. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to stay motionless, refusing to touch any button or lever. Luis muttered, almost to himself, "It's testing us, how far we'll bend," and I shivered, knowing that panic could make us betray every other rule we had so far observed. The sub felt like a fragile egg in the hands of some colossal sentient abyss, and the demand of Rule 5 weighed heavier than any physical pressure. Time became meaningless as we drifted deeper, each moment elongated by tension and fear. My eyes darted from instrument to instrument, tracking shifts in currents, pressure, and the subtle distortions in the water outside. Shadows slid across the windows, lingering just beyond reach, almost daring us to react hastily. Luis's hands trembled slightly over his own console, a stark reminder of how easy it could be to falter. I forced my own body to remain rigid, gripping the chair, counting each slow inhale, internalizing the lesson of Rule 5. Panic was not just dangerous, it was invitation to death. The deeper we went, the more the sub responded unpredictably to currents and unseen forces, and the temptation to touch something, anything, to correct perceived errors was unbearable. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine as a shadow darted across the lighted perimeter, a shape with an almost deliberate intelligence. "It knows when we're tense," Luis whispered, voice barely audible. I could only nod, swallowing hard, resisting the urge to react instinctively. The shadows were like a predator, measuring our restraint, and any impulsive touch could cost us everything. As the mission progressed, the sub jolted again, more violently this time, and instruments blinked with rapid, chaotic signals. My fingers hovered, itching to compensate, but I forced them back down, focusing on the rhythm of my breathing. Luis's face was pale, eyes wide as he murmured about patterns he saw in the flickers and shifts outside, suggesting the trench wasn't just empty water, but a consciousness aware of us. Every vibration of the hull, every subtle lurch, was a test, and obeying Rule 5 felt like the only tether to sanity. The panic clawing at the edges of my mind was almost unbearable, yet restraint was the only way to survive. By the time we reached a mapped chasm deeper than anything previously explored, the sub's instruments were vibrating in subtle sync with movements in the shadows. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the abyss itself had weight and intent. Luis muttered something about how one touch could trigger systems we weren't ready for, and I realized the enormity of obeying Rule 5. It was not just about control, it was about the margin between life and death, about ensuring that fear did not translate into catastrophe. Shadows moved outside, in patterns too precise to be natural, almost as if the trench itself monitored our compliance. Even brief lapses in attention were punished by the environment. Subtle shifts, unexplainable movements that made my chest tighten with anxiety. I found myself gripping the armrests, focusing on counting heartbeats, ignoring the urge to touch a lever or adjust a dial. Luis glanced nervously at the panels, whispering observations that made my skin crawl, each one confirming that the abyss outside was alive, aware and responsive. I realized that Rule 5 wasn't a suggestion. It was an absolute requirement, a single moment of panic, sufficient to invite consequences beyond imagination. By the end of that day's descent, the sub felt like a fragile capsule floating in a living entity of pressure and shadow. Every flicker of movement, every subtle vibration, became a test of our composure. Luis finally muttered, "If we break this one," and trailed off, leaving the threat suspended in the stale, humid air. I clutched the console, forcing myself to breathe slowly, knowing that any impulsive reaction could doom us. Rule 5 had shown its power, reminding me that panic was more dangerous than any shadow, more lethal than any pressure outside the hull, and more unforgiving than the Mariana Trench itself. I felt the first real pang of guilt the moment I considered stepping away from my station, knowing full well Rule 6, never leave your assigned post in the submersible without informing the crew. The shadows outside the sub's thick glass seemed to shift as if noticing every twitch, every thought of rebellion. Luis was hunched over the control panel, eyes flicking nervously toward me, and he muttered, "Don't even think about wandering off, not here." The Mariana Trench's abyss pressed in from all directions, and a strange vertigo threatened to unbalance me. Every instinct screamed to check the far side of the cabin, to investigate a noise, a shimmer in the dim lights, but I froze, aware that one misstep could be fatal. Hours earlier, a metallic groan reverberated through the hull, and I felt a magnetic pull toward the rear of the sub, curiosity clawing at my resolve. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, seeming to lead me with subtle teasing gestures that made my stomach churn. I pressed my palms flat against the console, trying to anchor myself, but the temptation lingered, an itch I couldn't scratch. Luis's whispered warnings echoed in my mind. "It's a trap if you step away." The sub seemed alive, aware of our smallest movements, and I realized that abandoning my post could invite consequences far beyond physical danger. The sub tilted slightly as we navigated a deep chasm, and I imagined what might be waiting in the darkened corners behind me. Shadows coiled, shifting in intelligence that felt almost sentient, observing, calculating. Luis glanced at me sharply, tension written across every line of his face, and muttered, "The moment you leave, it notices." I swallowed hard, feeling the cold dread creeping up my spine. Rule 6 wasn't just about protocol, it was a survival measure, a tether to sanity, keeping each of us accountable and preventing the abyss from exploiting weakness. I hugged the console tightly, forcing my gaze forward. Minutes dragged into hours, and the subsystems hummed a constant rhythm that contrasted sharply with the irregular, sinister movements outside. I documented everything, but my hands itched to roam, to investigate noises that had no origin, to follow the shapes that teased at the edges of our lights. Luis muttered about patterns in the shadows, how they seemed to track our movements, predicting intentions before we acted. I clenched my fists, forcing them to remain still, trying to remember that even a small lapse could trigger a catastrophic chain reaction. Rule 6 weighed on me, not as a guideline, but as a lifeline, each second at my post, a fragile thread holding us together. As we descended deeper into uncharted sections of the trench, the shadows grew bolder, weaving through the darkness with impossible precision. I could feel a pull, almost magnetic, guiding me toward the rear, toward systems I wasn't authorized to touch, toward compartments that seemed alive. Luis's voice broke the oppressive silence. "You feel it too, don't you?" I nodded, knowing that acknowledging it might make the presence more aware of us. My pulse quickened, sweat stinging my eyes, but I forced myself to stay in place, heart hammering as if the shadows themselves could hear it. The sub's lights flickered slightly, and for a moment, the shadows outside formed shapes that resembled us, mirroring movements in the cabin almost mockingly. Luis whispered, "They know when you think of leaving, they respond." I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting each second, pressing my palms into the console. The temptation to move, to check the far side of the cabin, clawed at my reason, but Rule 6 anchored me, reminding me that obedience was survival, and the abyss had infinite patience for those who faltered. At one point, a sudden current rocked the sub, shifting our equilibrium, and I felt my body sway involuntarily. Shadows stretched and twisted against the rocky trench walls, as if reacting to our slightest imbalance. I pressed my back against the console, gripping it with every ounce of strength, refusing to be lured away from my post. Luis murmured about unseen entities, tracking every action, and I shivered, realizing the sub wasn't merely a vessel, it was a fragile cage in the hands of something far more intelligent and patient than we could comprehend. Rule 6 wasn't an arbitrary mandate, it was a boundary drawn against a force we had no hope of fully understanding. Time and space warped. As we continued deeper, the sub groaning under pressure, the shadows coiling tighter with every flicker of light. I noted every anomaly, documenting irregularities in water density, light refraction, and subtle movement beyond comprehension. Luis's gaze flicked repeatedly toward the far corners of the cabin, tension etched into his face, silently acknowledging the peril of wandering. Each moment at my post felt like an eternity, every second a test of will against instinct and fear. Rule 6 became a mantra in my mind, a reminder that even the smallest deviation could invite disaster. Suddenly, the sub's exterior lights flickered, as if reacting to our heightened stress, and I felt a presence, something that seemed to brush against the hull like a living thing. Luis whispered, barely audible, "They can sense hesitation," and I shivered, knowing that my impulses were being monitored by something beyond our comprehension. I pressed my hands tighter to the console, forcing my thoughts away from curiosity, refusing to move. The shadows outside responded to every twitch, every thought of leaving my station, and I realized the trench was less water than sentient pressure, alive in ways that defied logic. By the end of our descent, fatigue and fear weighed heavily on us, yet I remained at my post, gripping the console, staring ahead at instruments and shadows alike. Luis exhaled shakily, muttering, "We made it, for now," and I knew that even the tiniest lapse could undo everything. The sub felt like a fragile island, suspended in an ocean that watched, tested, and waited for missteps. Obedience to Rule 6 had preserved our lives thus far, but the awareness of how thin the line was left a lingering dread that refused to fade. The shadows outside continued to coil and shift, silent but patient, waiting for the moment we might falter. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, the first time my gaze drifted too close to the windows, and I had to remind myself, almost violently, Rule 7. Never look directly into the abyss outside the submersible. The Mariana Trench yawned around us, infinite and black, and every shadow seemed alive, shifting with a deliberate intelligence. Luis's voice trembled as he said, "Don't stare, it's not what it seems," and I nodded, forcing my eyes back to the console. The water outside was no longer just a void. It was a predator, coiling and waiting, sensing the slightest curiosity in us. Each moment I dared to glance felt like an invitation, a trap for the mind and the senses. The shadows pressed closer as we descended, twisting and bending unnaturally along the trench walls. I kept telling myself it was just pressure, just my imagination, but the instinctive pull to look was maddening. Luis muttered about the patterns he saw, how the shapes moved differently when we glanced at them. As if aware of observation, I clenched my fists, forcing myself to trace lines on the charts instead, counting heartbeats to maintain focus. Rule 7 weighed on me like an iron chain, a constant reminder that the abyss could reach into the mind as easily as it could brush the sub's hull. Hours passed in a tense rhythm of flickering lights and impossible shadows, and the sub seemed to hum with an unspoken intelligence. The deeper we went, the more the darkness outside shifted, forming shapes that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I tried to log every anomaly, every flicker, every movement, but the urge to glance just once was relentless. Luis whispered about the creatures we might be tempting, about intelligence lurking in the void, and I shivered, imagining shapes just outside our fragile beams of light. The lesson of Rule 7 was terrifyingly clear. Some things are not meant to be observed directly. At one point, the sub tilted sharply, and the external lights reflected off particles in the water, creating shapes that mimicked familiar forms: hands, faces, eyes, but distorted, impossible, and alien. I caught myself almost staring, the pull hypnotic, and Luis barked, "Stop, don't even think about it." His sudden intensity snapped me back to the instruments, to the reality of the controls, and I pressed my palms firmly against the console. The abyss outside was more than empty water. It was aware, reactive, and infinitely patient, waiting for a lapse in obedience to Rule 7. The deeper we descended, the more subtle the movements became, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably deliberate. I felt a presence at the edge of perception, something that twisted with shadows and moved with intelligence beyond comprehension. Every flicker of the lights outside made my head ache, and every reflection threatened to draw my eyes. Luis kept murmuring observations under his breath, describing shapes and angles that defied physics, reminding me that the abyss itself was alive in ways we could not begin to understand. I pressed my back against the seat, forcing my eyes toward the console and away from the windows, clinging to sanity and Rule 7 alike. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours, the sub's groaning metal amplifying every movement in the darkness. The shadows outside seemed to pulse with rhythm, responding to the slightest shift in our attention, almost aware of our temptation. I noted every anomaly meticulously, documenting changes in light refraction, pressure waves, and subtle currents, but the pull to glance remained, a gnawing ache in my mind. Luis whispered, "It learns from our focus," and I realized with dread that the abyss was not passive. It measured, waited, and tested obedience. A single look could trigger consequences we couldn't survive. The sub's external lamps flickered briefly, throwing long writhing shadows across the trench walls. My pulse quickened, and I had to force my eyes to stay on the panels, resisting the hypnotic dance of shapes outside. Luis muttered about the previous missions, about crew members who couldn't resist the pull and were never seen again, their last recorded notes full of frantic, meaningless scribbles. I swallowed hard, gripping the console, and I felt the suffocating weight of the darkness, a living intelligence pressing against our vessel. Rule 7 was no longer advice. It was the only shield between us and the unknown intelligence outside. As we navigated an especially narrow canyon, the shapes outside seemed to anticipate our movements, shifting in ways that suggested they could read intent. I felt my hands tremble over the console, my head aching from resisting the urge to look directly at the abyss. Luis's voice broke the tension, whispering, "If you even glance, it knows." And I felt a wave of nausea as the truth settled in. The abyss wasn't just water, it was a predator, a sentient void that thrived on curiosity and weakness. Obedience to Rule 7 was as essential as breathing, the thin line between life and something unimaginable. Hours blurred into a tense rhythm of observation, documentation, and avoidance. The shadows continued to coil and twist outside, forming patterns that felt almost communicative, almost intelligent. Each flicker of light, each reflection, was a potential trap, a test of willpower. Luis muttered about how they might adapt, how attention itself could provoke them, and I shivered, realizing that maintaining focus on the console was as much a defense as any physical barrier. My resolve grew taut, every muscle straining, as the trench pressed closer and the pull to look remained relentless. By the end of the descent for that day, the shadows outside had grown bolder, almost testing the limits of the sub's lights. I could feel their intelligence in the way they moved, in the rhythm of their presence, and I realized that Rule 7 was more than a precaution, it was survival. Luis exhaled shakily, muttering, "We made it through, this time," and I felt the weight of that statement settle into my bones. The trench seemed to watch, silent, patient, aware of our every thought, waiting for the moment we faltered. The first time the shadowed shapes seemed to twist towards something I couldn't name, I felt my pulse spike uncontrollably, and had to remind myself, almost desperately, Rule 8. Never allow curiosity to override your instincts. Luis leaned closer, eyes wide and panicked, muttering, whatever you do, don't follow it." The Mariana Trench pressed against the sub from all sides, a living weight of darkness and intent, and I realized that a single impulsive movement could doom us. The compulsion to investigate, the rustle in the corner of the lights, the subtle movement of shadows just beyond our reach, was almost unbearable. I gripped the console, forcing my attention to the instruments, counting my heartbeats to stave off the irresistible draw. Earlier, we had drifted close to a cavern where strange bioluminescent flashes danced against jagged walls, and my fingers itched to adjust the controls, to explore, to uncover what lay hidden. Luis shook his head, whispering, "It's a trap if you give in, even a little," and I felt the gravity of the warning in my chest. The lights outside the sub flickered, shadows bending unnaturally, suggesting intelligence rather than randomness. Every instinct screamed to look closer, to investigate, but the lessons of Rule 8 echoed in my mind like a mantra. Curiosity could kill us here, and I had to suppress the very instincts that made us human. Minutes stretched into hours as we moved further into uncharted depths, the sub vibrating subtly under currents we couldn't predict. Shapes swirled just beyond the lamp's reach, almost beckoning, almost teasing, yet each one was a test of restraint. Luis muttered about past missions where scientists had given in to the compulsion to explore or touch, and how quickly silence had claimed them. I forced my eyes back to the console, fingers trembling, resisting the urge to glance at what the abyss seemed to offer. Rule 8 became a lifeline, a mental cord tethering me to rationality, as the abyss sought to manipulate instinct and lure us into peril. The sub shuddered violently as we navigated a narrow crevice, and I felt my mind reel from the suggestion that something outside was waiting, anticipating our actions. Shadows elongated and flickered with impossible angles, and I fought the urge to investigate them physically, to adjust our position or angle. Luis's whispered voice trembled. "It watches what you want, and it tests you for it," and I felt a cold pressure coil around my chest. I pressed my palms firmly against the console, eyes fixed on the instruments, knowing that even a momentary lapse in judgment could trigger catastrophe. Rule 8 was not a suggestion. It was a protective measure against the most dangerous force of all, our own impulses. As the hours wore on, fatigue and isolation gnawed at the edges of our minds. Every flicker of the lights, every ripple outside the sub, became a temptation. I documented anomalies methodically, noting the angles of shadows, shifts in water pressure, and the faint glow of creatures that seemed to inhabit the blackness. Luis whispered about patterns he could perceive, subtle movements that hinted at intelligence, and I shivered, aware that curiosity here was a predator disguised as knowledge. The compulsion to reach, touch, or investigate was almost maddening, but Rule 8 demanded that instincts bow to caution. At one point, the sub jolted sharply, and a strange vibration passed through the hull, as if something outside was testing our attention. Shadows moved in ways that defied natural physics, elongating and retracting with precision that suggested intelligence, almost taunting us. I forced myself to focus on the console, counting every second, resisting the irresistible urge to investigate the anomaly. Luis muttered, "Don't give in, not even a fraction," and I realized that the abyss could exploit the smallest lapse in judgment. The pull of curiosity was relentless, but obedience to Rule 8 had become the only thing keeping us alive. The deeper we descended, the more the trench seemed alive, responding to our focus, to our hesitation, to our instincts. The shadows outside mirrored thoughts and intentions we didn't voice, and I felt the sub vibrating under some unspoken awareness. Luis's face was pale, eyes wide, and he whispered warnings about how previous crews had faltered in the same way. Each flicker of light, each subtle movement outside became a test, an invitation to give in to curiosity, and I clung to Rule 8 as though it were a lifeline, knowing instinct alone could no longer guide me safely. Hours blurred into one continuous tense rhythm, each second weighted by the possibility of failure. The sub hummed with life, or perhaps it was the trench itself, and shadows twisted in forms that seemed almost alive, almost aware. I gritted my teeth, documenting every anomaly, resisting the primal urge to move closer, to investigate, to react. Luis occasionally muttered warnings under his breath, almost conversationally with the shadows themselves, and I shivered at the implication. Rule 8 demanded vigilance, patience, and suppression of instinct, the hardest task I had faced since descending into this abyss. By the end of the descent for that segment, the sub felt like a fragile capsule, suspended in a living, breathing darkness that tested every instinct and impulse. Shadows lingered at the edges of light, coiling and teasing, waiting for the moment we might give in. Luis exhaled shakily, muttering, "We survived this round," and I realized how narrow the line had been between compliance and catastrophe. Rule 8 had kept our curiosity from destroying us, but I knew the trench was patient, infinitely so, and that every instinct would continue to be a challenge in the hours and days ahead. The first time I heard a faint tapping through the hull, I froze, heart hammering in my chest, and reminded myself, almost desperately, Rule 9. Never respond to any noise you can't identify. Luis's eyes widened as he muttered, "It's not just pressure, it's something else." Outside, the Mariana Trench pressed against the sub, blackness deep and infinite, and the shadows seemed to bend toward the sound, as if listening to our reaction. My hands tightened around the console, resisting the urge to search, investigate, or even react, knowing that curiosity could make the unknown aware of us. Every nerve in my body screamed to respond, but obeying the rule was the only tether to sanity. Hours earlier, the sound had started almost imperceptibly, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the sub's metal frame. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every creak and groan amplified as the tapping persisted. Luis whispered, "Ignore it, do not acknowledge it," and I nodded, though my instinct screamed to find its source. The shadows outside twisted with the light, almost teasing us, and I realized that the noise itself might be intelligent, testing our discipline. Rule 9 was more than a guideline. It was a commandment, in a place where acknowledging the unknown could draw its attention directly to you. As we drifted deeper into the abyss, the tapping grew louder and more deliberate, echoing along the hull in rhythms that felt almost sentient. Shadows coiled around rocks and ridges outside, twisting in ways that defied logic. Luis muttered theories under his breath about what could be producing the sound, but even he refused to touch the controls or investigate, a silent acknowledgement of the rule's importance. I pressed my hands against the console, forcing my mind to focus on charts and readings, counting slowly in my head, trying not to give in to the terrifying pull of curiosity. Suddenly the sub shuddered violently, and the lights flickered, casting long writhing shadows along the trench walls. The tapping continued, persistent and precise, almost like it was testing us, gauging our reactions. Luis's voice was tense, muttering, Don't respond. They notice." And I shivered, realizing that even thinking about responding could be dangerous. My instincts screamed to find the source, to investigate, to push a button or move a panel, but Rule 9 demanded restraint. The abyss outside seemed alive, coiling around us, aware of our impulses, waiting for the slightest lapse. Hours passed in a tense rhythm, each tap echoing like a heartbeat we weren't meant to follow. The sub's instruments flickered under stress, and every shadow outside seemed to stretch and twist in response to the noise. I tried documenting anomalies, noting the angles of light and the subtle movements in the water, but the pull to respond never ceased. Luis whispered about crew members who had faltered in the past, drawn to noises they shouldn't have acknowledged, and I shivered, imagining the consequences. Rule 9 was no longer precaution. It was a shield against something far more intelligent and dangerous than anything human. At one point, the tapping changed pattern, becoming a series of rapid, uneven beats that made the air in the sub feel thick with anticipation. Shadows outside danced in impossible geometries, bending and twisting like liquid, as if aware of our fear. I forced myself to breathe, gripping the console, eyes fixed on the charts, trying not to react even internally. Luis's voice trembled as he whispered, "They can sense hesitation. They know when you want to respond." And I realized that the abyss was more than pressure and darkness. It was aware, sentient, and testing the limits of our discipline. Rule 9 was the only tether keeping us from inviting disaster. The sub tilted slightly as we navigated a narrow canyon, and the tapping resonated in synchrony with the shadows outside, creating shapes that mimicked our movements almost mockingly. I felt the compulsion to look, to touch, to respond, but I forced myself to resist, counting slowly, focusing only on my post. Luis muttered again, "It's testing us. Every time we react, it learns," and I swallowed hard, feeling the oppressive weight of the abyss settle around us. Obedience to Rule 9 was survival. Any deviation could invite attention from entities we could neither see nor comprehend. Time lost meaning as the tapping continued in cycles, irregular yet purposeful, and the sub groaned under the immense pressure of the trench. I noted every anomaly, every flicker of light and movement, but I refused to give in to my instincts. Shadows coiled outside, almost taunting, waiting for the slightest acknowledgement, the smallest twitch that indicated attention. Luis exhaled shakily, muttering, "If we respond, we'll regret it," and I felt the truth of his words in the pit of my stomach. Rule 9 wasn't just a directive, it was the difference between life and the unseen intelligent threat lurking outside. By the end of that period, the tapping had become a constant companion, an ominous rhythm that refused to fade, yet we survived by clinging to restraint. The shadows outside lingered at the edge of the sub's lights, coiling and twisting, silent but attentive. I realized that the abyss watched for reactions as carefully as it watched the vessel itself. Luis muttered, "We made it, this time," and I felt the weight of survival settle into my bones. The trench was patient, infinitely so, and every sound was a test. Rule 9 had preserved us, but I knew we weren't safe yet. The abyss had only begun observing our obedience. The first time I glimpsed a shadow that moved independently of the currents, I froze, heart pounding, and reminded myself, almost desperately, Rule 10. Never underestimate the intelligence of what surrounds you in the trench. Luis's voice trembled as he whispered, "It knows us. It watches everything we do." The Mariana Trench pressed against the sub like a living, breathing entity, and the darkness beyond the lights seemed far more deliberate than mere shadows. I gripped the console tightly, forcing my eyes to remain on instruments, while my mind raced, imagining the intelligence coiled outside, observing our smallest movements. Every instinct screamed that even a casual dismissal could bring disaster, and the weight of obedience to Rule 10 settled heavily on me. Hours earlier, as we descended deeper into the trench, subtle movements in the water had caught my eye, elongated forms that twisted unnaturally, vanishing and reappearing without explanation. Luis glanced at me nervously, muttering, "They're learning patterns, habits, weaknesses." I tried to focus on readings, but the feeling of being watched was oppressive, tangible, as if the shadows themselves could understand our thoughts. Rule 10 became a mantra in my head, a constant reminder that underestimating the abyss's intelligence would be fatal. The sub creaked as if responding to the tension inside, amplifying the unease that pervaded the cabin. The deeper we went, the more the shadows outside seemed to anticipate our actions. Every adjustment of the sub, every glance toward the abyss, was mirrored in subtle, impossible ways. I felt the urge to correct minor shifts, to act instinctively, but Luis's voice, strained and shaky, reminded me, "Remember what I said. It notices everything." I pressed my palms flat against the console, resisting the compulsion to react impulsively. The intelligence outside wasn't passive. It seemed to read intent, testing patience, and waiting for the smallest lapse in judgment to exploit. At one point, a sudden vibration ran through the hull, sending my stomach into my throat. Shadows outside, coiled unnaturally, stretching in shapes that made no sense physically, yet suggested observation and awareness. Luis muttered, "It's learning from our panic, from hesitation," and I shivered, gripping the console tighter. I realized that Rule 10 wasn't just about fear, it was about the consequences of ignorance, about acknowledging the presence outside as sentient and calculating. One misjudgment could invite catastrophe, and the trench's patience seemed infinite, waiting for us to falter. Time stretched as we navigated the trench's jagged formations, the sub's hull creaking under pressure, the shadows outside, stretching and recoiling in patterns that made my head ache. Every flicker of light, every movement, was a test. Luis and I shared no words for long stretches, our silence punctuated only by strained whispers about anomalies and observations. I noted the smallest distortions in water pressure, the most subtle deviations in light reflection, documenting everything meticulously. Rule 10 was not just a rule, it was a survival mechanism, reminding us that intelligence here was not human, not predictable, and utterly patient. The sub shuddered violently as we passed an unusually narrow canyon, shadows twisting along the walls like dark rivers. My heart raced as I forced my attention to the controls, ignoring the instinct to glance at the most fluid, dynamic forms outside. Luis whispered about patterns he had observed, about how certain shapes seemed to respond to our reactions, almost testing our discipline. I clenched my fists, forcing my mind to obey Rule 10, knowing that even curiosity about the shadow's intelligence could trigger unseen consequences. The abyss wasn't passive, it adapted, learned and manipulated. As the hours dragged on, the intelligence outside seemed to grow bolder. Shadows coiled, forming intricate shapes that mimicked our own movements, almost mocking our restraint. I could feel the sub vibrating subtly in response, as if the trench itself was alive and aware of every micro-movement. Luis muttered, "They learn fast, faster than we can keep track," and I swallowed hard, realizing the depth of the threat. Obedience to Rule 10 demanded that I suppress curiosity, ignore instincts, and acknowledge the trench as a calculating entity with limitless patience. The sub's external lamps flickered intermittently, throwing eerie, shifting shapes across the trench walls. Every flicker seemed deliberate, a signal, a challenge, and I forced my eyes back to the console, resisting every instinct to investigate. Luis's whispers grew more frantic. "Don't underestimate it. Every move counts." And I felt the weight of his words settle in my bones. Shadows lurked just beyond our lights, coiling and bending in ways that defied physics. And I understood that the trench's intelligence was testing not only our actions, but our ability to perceive, reason, and obey. By the end of that day's descent, exhaustion pressed down on both of us, yet we remained vigilant, conscious of every movement, every shadow, every subtle shift in the water. Luis exhaled shakily, whispering, "We survived, barely," and I realized that the line between compliance and disaster had been razor thin. The trench seemed to observe silently, infinitely patient, measuring, calculating, waiting for the moment we might underestimate it. Rule 10 had preserved us once more, but I knew the final rule would demand the ultimate test of our discipline, courage, and understanding of what truly lurked in the deep. The moment I realized how deep we truly were, I felt a chill settle in my bones and reminded myself, almost desperately, Rule 11. Never assume you will leave the trench the same way you entered. Luis's eyes widened. The fatigue and terror of days submerged etched into every line of his face, and he muttered, "Nothing comes back unchanged. Nothing." The sub groaned under the immense pressure, shadows dancing outside like sentient smoke, and I knew that the abyss held a claim on every soul who entered its depths. Every instinct screamed that we weren't in control, that the trench was an entity that could rewrite our fate in ways we could barely comprehend. Hours earlier, I had noticed subtle distortions in the water, shadows that twisted unnaturally, forms that seemed to defy physics entirely. Luis whispered about patterns in the abyss, how every descent altered the space itself, how even time seemed different at this depth. I felt a creeping sense of dread as I realized that the trench did not simply contain us. It remade us in small, imperceptible ways, until nothing about our return could be taken for granted. Rule 11 was more than a rule. It was a recognition that survival was never guaranteed, and that leaving alive was only part of the equation. The sub's lights flickered, casting jagged shapes along the rocky walls, and I could feel the intelligence of the trench studying us, calculating, waiting. Shadows outside shifted, coiling and uncoiling as if aware of our thoughts, our fears, our every micro movement. Luis whispered, almost to himself, "It's patient. It knows we want to go home," and I shivered, realizing that wanting to survive might be exactly what made us vulnerable. Rule 11 demanded acceptance of uncertainty, a constant awareness that the abyss did not adhere to human logic, that even the sub could not protect us from its transformative power. Minutes stretched into hours, each second a taut wire of tension. The sub's hull vibrated with an almost imperceptible rhythm, shadows dancing in patterns that suggested awareness, intelligence, and intent. I noted the smallest anomalies, each one a potential warning, each one a hint that the trench was reshaping reality itself around us. Luis muttered about previous crews, about the stories left in fragmented recordings, and I realized with horror that none of them had returned unchanged. Every instinct, every observation, every careful action was insufficient to guarantee that we would exit unscathed. Rule 11 loomed larger than any other rule, the ultimate acknowledgement of the abyss's dominion. At one point, a sudden vibration coursed through the sub, stronger than anything before, and I felt my stomach lurch. Shadows outside elongated, folding in on themselves, shapes appearing and disappearing like illusions made flesh. Luis muttered, voice tight, "It's testing everything, our will, our obedience," and I gripped the console, forcing my gaze forward, aware that any misstep could alter not just our survival, but the very nature of who we were. The trench was patient, infinite, and every moment obeying Rule 11 reminded me that the abyss shaped fate itself. Hours blurred into an unbroken rhythm of tension, every flicker of light and shift of shadow feeding the sense of sentient observation. I documented anomalies meticulously, tracing patterns in water pressure, shadow distortions, and light refractions, but even scientific recording felt insufficient. Luis muttered repeatedly, "Even thinking about the surface is dangerous. It doesn't want us out the same." I shivered, realizing the truth behind the rule. The Mariana Trench didn't just threaten life, it threatened reality, perception, identity. Rule 11 demanded not only caution, but acceptance of the unknown. The deeper we descended, the more the trench seemed to stretch and warp around the sub, shadows coiling like living serpents, moving in response to every motion. Luis's eyes darted nervously to the windows, and he whispered, "It learns, it adapts, it changes everything we know." I gripped the console with white-knuckled hands, forcing myself to remain calm, resisting the instinct to flee or to check any movement outside. Every flicker, every vibration, every shadowed twist reminded me that Rule 11 wasn't just about survival. It was about accepting that the abyss could and would change us irreversibly. Suddenly, the sub lurched violently, lights flickering, alarms murmuring softly, and shadows coiled against the windows like dark fingers. Luis muttered, voice trembling, "We might not come back, not as we were," and I realized with a sinking dread that the rule was true in every sense. Every instinct, every plan, every hope for a straightforward return was irrelevant. The trench had already begun its silent transformation. Rule 11 left no room for certainty, only vigilance, and the terrifying awareness that leaving alive was no longer synonymous with returning intact. By the time we stabilized, the sub felt fragile, suspended in a living darkness that seemed to pulse with its own purpose. Shadows lingered at the edges of the lamp's glow, coiling, observing, waiting for the moment we might falter. Luis exhaled shakily, whispering, "We survived, but nothing will be the same," and I felt the weight of those words settle in my chest. The Mariana Trench seemed to watch, patient beyond measure, and I understood that obedience to all the rules, including Rule 11, had preserved us only in the narrowest, most conditional sense. I glanced at the instruments, noting pressures and currents, but the abyss outside seemed to stretch farther than the sub could measure, deeper than the lights could reach. Luis muttered again, almost conversationally with the shadows, "It's still learning, still waiting," and I felt the oppressive weight of truth. The trench did not simply contain us. It transformed everything, silently, invisibly, eternally. Rule 11 left no room for hope that we could return unchanged, only the stark awareness that the Mariana Trench held dominion over fate itself. As we began the slow, cautious ascent, the shadows remained, coiling at the edges of our lights, patient, intelligent, watching every movement. I kept my hands on the console, eyes forward, knowing that every lapse could be catastrophic. Luis muttered once more, voice trembling, "We'll leave, but we will never be the same," and I swallowed hard, feeling the abyss inside me as much as outside. The Mariana Trench had claimed not just our physical safety, but our certainty, our perception, our very sense of reality. The final rule, Rule 11, lingered in my mind like a weight I could never shake. The story ends here with an unresolved, ominous note, maintaining suspense and dread. The abyss has changed them irreversibly. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.